Add critical language proficiency to your resume with language training at MEI. Through group classes or one-on-one instruction in Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Turkish, and more will help you achieve fluency so that you and your resume stand apart from the crowd. Online and in-person classes begin March 27th. Visit mei.edu/education for a list of classes and tutoring options, or call us at 202-770-0344. From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Fadi Nassar, U.S. Fellow at MEI and Director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution, and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Lebanese American University. Today's episode will zoom in on Lebanon's crisis, with a focus on the collapse of the country's currency. Lebanon is unrecognizable. Nearly 4 years of unabated crisis have categorically altered the country's social and economic fabric. The joie de vivre that once defined Lebanon is now replaced by such misery, pessimism, and despair. Deprivation is the unbearable new normal, and it affects every aspect of our lives. Depositors are deprived of their life savings, retirees from livable pensions, youth from decent jobs, and children from their basic rights. Access to basic services and goods, including food, healthcare, education, and clear water, have become a luxury as prices have skyrocketed and purchasing power plummeted. Meanwhile, regular provision of essential utilities like electricity and clean water is unheard of, the exception that proves the rule of deprivation. In the midst of a new debilitating wave of hyperinflation, we are particularly grateful to have with us the nuanced commentary of Mike Azar. An active voice since the start of the crisis, based in Beirut, he is an international finance professional who advises governments on financing transactions in strategic sectors such as energy and infrastructure. He is also a former professorial lecturer of international economics at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he also earned his graduate degree, focusing on international finance and emerging markets. Thank you, Mike, for being here with us.
Yep, thank you for inviting me, Nick.
For non-experts, currency crises can appear to be very complicated. I was hoping we could start this discussion off by you walking our audience through the collapse of the Lira.
Sure. I mean, that's a question that's kind of complicated, but also not complicated at the same time. I mean, Lebanon has been for 4 years now suffering from the consequences of multiple crises. You know, countries usually go through a banking crisis or a government debt crisis. Here, we're going through everything. We have a banking crisis, meaning we really don't have a banking system at the moment. All of the banks, the Lebanese banks, are insolvent. We have a sovereign debt crisis. The government has not been able to repay its debts. We have a balance of payments crisis, meaning that we import significantly more than we export, and we just don't have enough dollars coming in to fund all of these imports. And on top of that, we have something that very rarely happens in the modern era, which is a central bank insolvency crisis. Ultimately, it's a debt crisis where every institution in this country, from the banking system to the government to the central bank, have borrowed money to fund essentially the fixed exchange rate, meaning to fund the very high import level of this country. And they've borrowed it mainly from the public. And when that all came crashing down, the natural consequence of that is a collapse in the value of the currency, but also a collapse in the value of people's deposits. And both of those things have been, what we've seen over the last 4 years. And then add to that, there's been no action taken by the state. In fact, the actions that have been taken are kind of a patchwork where it's kind of these very short-term measures to buy some time, and the time that they're buying now is actually getting shorter and shorter with each attempt but we buy a little bit of time at a much bigger cost. So again, essentially borrowing more from the public in order to just buy a little bit more time, all to avoid doing the fundamental reforms that are needed here, the kind of fundamental economic reforms, the banking sector restructuring, the public finance reform. Really, it's we're starting almost from rock bottom, and there's so much work that needs to be done, and unfortunately, really none of it is being done at the moment.
Thanks, Mike. I know we're going to get into this a bit later on, but the word reform has become a sort of buzzword that, in many ways, is used freely, and it becomes, especially for those outside, unclear what reforms are needed. What are the particular policies that are being presented as? In other words, what are the reforms that should be implemented? It's not just reform as a word. So I was hoping maybe you could help us fine tune what are some of those critical reforms, at least with regards to the currency crisis.
Sure. I mean, this is one of the few situations in Lebanon where, at the beginning of the crisis, you had an army of economists, Lebanese in Lebanon and abroad, meeting regularly, doing roundtables, writing papers, proposing policies, and ultimately all of that kind of went through a filtration process where there's general agreement on what actually needs to get done to at least attempt to stabilize the currency and stabilize the situation here. And this is just a very straightforward financial crisis. You have banks that are bankrupt, and the way that you restructure those banks is something that has been done thousands of times in countries all over the world throughout history. So that process is very well known, and that applies also to your central bank. That's one work stream. You have banks that just cannot repay their debts, and you need to restructure their balance sheets. Now, what makes it difficult here is that restructuring the banks and the central bank's balance sheet, by definition, means that you need to lower the debts that they have that they can't repay. And in Lebanon's case, those debts are mainly to the Lebanese public. So we're in a situation where politically it's very difficult to execute that, because what it means is you need to tell a large proportion of Lebanese depositors that their money is not available, and how the amount of money they may get back is maybe an amount that is much lower than what they would expect. But to the extent we don't do that, what that means is that the financial system will never recover, the economy will never recover, and people's future earnings potential will be depressed. That's, I think, one of the most challenging aspects of this crisis, and one of the key reasons why the currency is continuing to devalue.
I mean, the past few weeks have been, I mean, we've seen this new wave of hyperinflation and policies that in many ways ground what you're saying. I was wondering, just for our audience, if you could help contextualize what's going on this week in Lebanon.
To be honest, what's going on this week is, to me, not different than what's happened from time to time over the last 4 years, where the currency is stable for a little while, and then it starts to depreciate very quickly. And then the central bank comes out with a statement saying that they will intervene in the currency market to stabilize the exchange rate. And that's successful for a short time, and the currency stabilized at a slightly lower rate than where it was at the peak when it started to devalue, but still higher than it was just before that. And then you have the same cycle that repeats over and over and over again. And that's what's been happening from when the exchange rate was 2,000 Lebanese pounds to the dollar to where it is today. It reached 90,000 pounds to the dollar. So the central bank is just saying that it's going to sell dollars into the market. The question is, where are those dollars coming from? What's changed actually? Is there a new source of dollars coming into the country? Are we all of a sudden exporting, and is there all this foreign investment coming in? Nothing has changed. It's just we keep digging into the piggy bank that we have, which when we started off 4 years ago was close to 30 billion, and now it's under 10 billion. And when we go through this same cycle in 6 months, it'll be whatever, 6 billion, and until it reaches zero.
I know it's a big question, but at this point, I mean, you just illustrated it's nearing 100,000 lira the dollar. Can the lira be saved?
My view is that probably today it's very difficult to save the lira just because of the tremendous damage that has been caused and how much people's confidence in this currency has been shaken. For the audience to be able to maybe relate it more to their lives, I mean, imagine you have all your life savings in a currency, and in the course of a year, your life savings are worth nothing anymore. Are you ever going to put your savings in that currency again, no matter what the state tells you, reforms that they've done? Probably not. And, people always give the counter example. Well, in the early 90s, there was a similar severe devaluation in the Lebanese pound, and people went back to trusting it after some reforms were done. But I don't think that's the case, because if you look at the Lebanese banking sector, people have had their deposits, 70 to 80% of them in dollars, even when, the so-called confidence in the Lebanese pound was at its peak. So even through the 2000s, people didn't trust the Lebanese pound. What they trusted was that the central bank and their banks would pay them their deposits in dollars. So people would earn their salary in Lebanese pounds, put it in the bank, tell the bank, convert it to dollars for me. They thought they actually had dollars, but what they really had was just a promise from the central bank to pay them in dollars. And what they're realizing today is that that promise is actually no good. And so that's gone. So what will they do now? People will actually, if they earn money in the local currency, what they'll want to do is actually convert it into real dollars, not just dollars in the banking system. And if that's the case, then you'll never be able to restore the Lebanese pound's role as a kind of a functional currency in this country. And so what you need is currency reform ultimately, after you've kind of done all of the restructuring of the public sector and the banks, and kind of have an IMF program and done all the things that you need to do. That would be at the very end of that road.
So, what we're seeing in Lebanon, for those of our audience members who may not be following, where we're seeing like supermarkets putting prices in dollars, but salaries for most of Lebanese do not reflect that shift. When we're talking about if the lira can't be saved, what's an alternative that doesn't undermine those hardest hit by the crisis? Have their life savings, who have their salaries, their income all in lira.
There is no solution in Lebanon today that is going to be an ideal solution, because when you have a public debt burden that is kind of aggregated losses in the economy today are close to $80 billion. Our economy is probably less than 20 billion today. So you have losses, public debts in excess of 4 times the size of your economy. And to make that adjustment, that's a very severe adjustment you have to make. That's a lot of wealth that has been destroyed, and you just have to acknowledge that it's been destroyed. The reason that pricing is happening in dollars in Lebanon today is because it's impossible to price in Lebanese pounds. When you're a very import dependent country, your prices are linked to the value of the dollar, because most of the things that are being sold here are either fully imported, or a large proportion of their value is from an imported good. So if you're a store owner and you're selling a product, the Lebanese pound today is, let's say, 50,000 pounds to the dollar. It's an item that costs $1. Tomorrow, the Lebanese pound all of a sudden is 60,000. So you've priced at 50,000, but between one day and the next, you need to adjust your prices. And then constantly you're having to do that. So you're not able to price anymore. In fact, you end up pricing over the current rate, because you need to protect yourself from these very volatile movements in the exchange rate between one day and the next. So after a few years, I think merchants here have kind of gotten that. And so most places today price in dollars. You can pay in the local currency at the market rate, which changes, but pricing, the sticker price, is in dollars. I don't fundamentally think that's a bad thing, because that's what was happening before, right? It was just they were showing it to you in Lebanese pounds, but underneath the hood, the price was in dollars. So now at least you can kind of have the same price. It's not going to change from one day to the next, at least on the sticker. What you need to do is make sure that people can afford those prices, right? I don't care if something costs $5 or $10. If my wage is high enough that I can afford it, then then there's not really a problem. So the kind of the sticker price is not an issue. It's what is the wealth that's being generated in this country every year and incomes and whether they can afford that or not. Because even if you're pricing in Lebanese pounds, if you're doubling the price every few months in Lebanese pounds, but salaries aren't doubling in Lebanese pounds, you have the same problem. So again, it goes back to what is the outcome that you're trying to reach, right? If the outcome is we need to stabilize the economy, we need to start growth again. And in order to do that, what are the constituent parts to that? Okay, you need to fix your banking sector. You can't have a banking sector or a stable currency if you have a bankrupt central bank. Okay, we got to fix that. Same with public finances. So we know what the constituent parts are in order to have economic growth. And then, you can kind of take that as far as you want. There's micro reforms in terms of specific sectors that you want to support. We're not even at that level yet, because that's kind of the level of a normal functioning economy where you have a functioning state that's deciding kind of, okay, which sectors do we need to support and what kind of an economy or industries can we be competitive in. But step one is you need to have kind of the basics, which is a functioning central bank, functioning banks, and a basic functioning state. And we don't have those today. So if you don't fix those, I don't care how you want to price your goods, people will not be able to afford it. And in fact, it gets worse, which is as much as people can't afford things today compared to where we were a few years ago, if you don't fix the problems that's kind of giving rise to the devaluation and your multitudes of crises, then prices are going to keep going up faster than incomes. And so ultimately, what happens at the end of that road when people are not able to afford basic sustenance anymore? Then you start forcing people out of the country because they really just cannot afford to survive here. And you'll end up needing to force a lot of people out in order to kind of reach a very lower level of economic output that you can sustain, which is kind of the worst case scenario, which is where this country is headed at the moment.
Could you just unpack that last part? In a sense, you're telling us there's a seeming deliberate effort for an exodus, or at least for driving people out the country. Could you just contextualize it, maybe for our audience members who might not be too familiar with the economics behind it, of how that could stabilize the crisis in the worst of ways?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you a simple example. Today, Lebanon imports $3 billion of goods per year, more than it exports or otherwise brings in income. So that $3 billion needs to be funded in some way, right? I mean, we're talking food, petroleum products, just kind of everything that we import from abroad. And we import a ton because we just do not have a productive economy. The economic policies and monetary policies of the last 30 years have really destroyed industry here, which is why we are so import dependent. It's one of the problems that we need to fix. So, how do you fund that 3 billion per year? So far, it's been the central bank. The central bank, and this is the longer story of how we got here. The central bank was encouraging the Lebanese diaspora, and we have a very large and well-off diaspora abroad, to send their money back to Lebanon. The central bank was promising them very high incentives, which today clearly turned out to not be a promise worth anything because all that money is gone. It was spent. So the central bank would take those dollars, and then whenever the country wants to import goods, the central bank would fund those imports. So it would sell those dollars to merchants so that they can import more goods into the country. Now we have about 8 billion of that left. Eventually, that's going to reach a very small number where the central bank won't be able to cover the import needs of this country. So what happens when that's the case? The currency devalues. It devalues because you need a way, and this is kind of just the economic mechanism, you need a way to force people to import less, meaning to consume less. And you need them to consume 3 billion less if you don't do any of the needed reforms. So think products have to become unaffordable. You need prices to go up to an extent where people aren't able to consume anymore. You lower your import bill to a level that's actually sustainable. And if you don't do any reforms, what that means is you have to just cut it 3 billion. Now, if you kind of go down the appropriate track when countries have this type of a crisis, they do the kind of reforms that encourage and increase in the flow of dollars into the country. So you support businesses that are exporting, you encourage foreign investment into the country. There's many different pathways. Here, you're not doing that. In fact, you're exporting less now because your economy's in the very perverse way becoming less competitive because the cost of doing business here is becoming very, very high. Usually, when you go through a currency crisis, actually, production costs in a country become lower because when your currency devalues, you're paying people lower salary. Here, that's not happening. We pay maybe the highest electricity price, maybe on the planet, actually. So our production costs are very high. So we're exporting less than we were before. Anyway, to make a long story short, what that means is you need people to consume less. How are you going to do that? At some point, people just can't consume any less. So they have to leave this country. You're going to have more reliance on maybe humanitarian aid from abroad. And that's actually happening. Western governments are paying the salaries of Lebanese soldiers today. And there'll be more of those kinds of efforts. And then on the other hand, you'll have people who just leave. They got on boats and leave. They try to make it to Europe. And that's how you readjust and reduce your import bill. A very, very destructive and unnecessary process, which we could avoid still. And we could have avoided. I mean, that's really what's been happening since 2019. That just will keep happening and will get worse.
I mean, terrifying implications, certainly that, significantly undermine the fundamental rights of those being forced, in many ways, forced to leave due to the unbearability of living in Lebanon. You mentioned something, it can still be avoided. Could you just walk us through those key steps that can help avert such a situation?
Sure. I mean, let's say we're now living in a world where we have a Lebanese government who wants to actually solve this problem with the least possible harm to the general public. They would start off with the arrangement that was agreed to with the IMF last April. We're coming up a year now since that framework agreement, which very few of it has been implemented. You would fix your banking system by taking the deposits of the wealthiest people in this country, which today you cannot pay back, and you put them in a fund to pay them back over a longer term. But you get them out of your banking system because you know that amount of debt is not something the banking system is able to repay. That is the restructuring process. Really, to kind of break it down and make it as simple as possible, that's it. You have maybe 70, 60 billion of deposits that the banking system can't repay. You need to do something with them. And really, it comes down to 5 or 6,000 individuals because we have so much wealth inequality here that the vast majority of the deposits belong to very few, but they happen to be the most politically well connected and a very strong voice here. And politicians respond to that. And that's why nothing gets done. You do that, you fixed your banking system. And that's been the biggest stumbling block here is what do you do with those big deposits?
Can I stop you here, Mike, just for a bit? Can you zoom in on that chunk of deposits and help us differentiate between the more middle class, upper middle class, and that top 1%? Because it's important to distinguish them, and often they're lumped together.
Sure. At the beginning of our talk, when I explained how this is ultimately a debt crisis where various institutions of the state, whether the central bank or the government, were borrowing money in different ways in order to sustain a very unsustainable economic system. Most of that borrowing came in one way or the other from deposits in the Lebanese banking system. So that's why those deposits can't be repaid because they were borrowed and then spent. And now the amount of them is just way too high that there's not really any way to repay them today. Now, another thing worth mentioning is that half of Lebanese people don't even have bank accounts. So they're not at all affected by the issue of what do you do with deposits, except insofar as if you don't do anything, you destroy the economy and they're affected that way. But they don't have deposits. So they're indifferent to kind of what you do with those. Now, among the people that do have deposits, over the last 4 years, people, that rely on their savings to survive, usually people that are less wealthy, have been withdrawing their money. And so a large proportion of accounts, the things we don't have data, so it's hard to kind of put precise numbers on it. But accounts of people who are not super wealthy have been drawn down because people have been using their money, getting it out of the banking system, spending it on expenses. And you also then have, I think the number is, the last figure we have is that accounts that are sub $100,000 make up 88% of accounts in the Lebanese banking system. So that's sub 100,000. So that means there's 12% of accounts have above $100,000. And then as you go into the million plus, it becomes much smaller. That's why kind of the proposal of certain members of this current government, because there's not one unified view, but kind of the official position of this government is that they're going to attempt to save accounts up to 100,000, because that's the number they think, given what they've seen in terms of the assets of the banks and the central bank and what the government can afford to contribute. Up to $100,000 is what can be saved. Beyond that, you need to figure out what to do with those accounts in a way where maybe over the long term, through various kind of sources of income, you may be able to recover some of it. And that's actually where a big debate in this country is, which is what is fair? So let's say that the number of those deposits that cannot be repaid today is 70 billion. Some people say, well, okay, so they can't be repaid. We need to just write them off. End of story. Clean slate, and we move on from there. And on the other hand, you have people who say, no, these are ultimately public debts. These debts arose because of intentional public policies, whether it's government borrowing or central bank borrowing, but they're public debts. Therefore, the government should pay. Now, of course, that's not reasonable because one, the amount is too high, so the government can't pay even if it wanted to. So here it's not even a matter of equity. It's a matter of it's just not practical. It's not going to happen. But you do have loud voices here that propose that, because still, it's a very easy populist position to take. Let the government pay, not really considering that. What does that mean? That means let the taxpayer pay. That means a big transfer of wealth from the general public to very wealthy depositors, and still not enough. And when you keep this huge debt burden, your economy is not going to grow because you actually haven't solved anything. And then there's something kind of more in the middle, something that could be acceptable to the IMF, hopefully, and something that I consider to be more equitable, which is, okay, we can't pay these deposits now. We're not going to write them off. We put them in a designated fund, if you want. And to the extent, the economy does grow more rapidly than we expect, and we are able to generate much more wealth than we expect, and there's excess income in the country, from the public budget, then some of that excess can be used to make up those deposits once you've kind of distinguished between legitimate deposits and money that was earned illegitimately, because our banking system is full of illegitimate money from general illegitimate gains, warlords and money laundering and everything you want. So, you can be a little bit more precise about which deposits you would like to contribute to. And of course, that's one of the tools. The banks will have to contribute through, a process called a bail-in, to just not overcomplicate it. As banks grow in the future and start generating profits again, then some of those profits will also be used to make up some of the deposits. I mean, that's really been the solution since 2019. It's not really been any other way to do it. But unfortunately, today we're still having this internal debate because you have very loud voices that have taken a very populist position where they say, we refuse any solution that doesn't result in every depositor getting 100% of their money back. And that is just not a productive position.
But there have been other arguments, right, which challenge the cutoff point, right? How did the government decide this cutoff point? What are its implications on restoring confidence of the middle class in the banking sector? Because if we look at, let's say, someone who has $200,000, right, that's very different than the 1%. What happens to them in this plan?
Well, the 100,000 is a goal. Part of the process is you have to do an audit of the biggest banks here, which comprise, 90 plus percent or, 85 plus percent of the banking system. You need to do an audit of those banks to quantify the value of their assets, the value of their liabilities, what's the loss. So right now we're talking kind of very generally. All you can do today is set the process in place. And in fact, I don't think they should have even said 100,000 cutoff, because we don't know what it's going to be. For some banks, it could be more than 100,000. Ultimately, it's going to depend on the state of the individual banks. For some banks, it may not even be 100,000. Some banks may be not salvageable at all. That's the next complication, which we haven't even gotten into because, again, we haven't even started that process yet. But let's say someone has $200,000 in a bank where the audit and review of that bank indicates that 100,000 can be saved. That person would get up to 100,000 back, and the other 100,000 would go into a deposit recovery account, and then they would get that back gradually, subject to whatever conditions are agreed to. But that person may be in a bank where he may be able to get all 200,000 back, but also he may be in a bank where he can get zero back. I mean, this is the scale of the crisis, where if the money is not there and the assets aren't there, then there is no way to pay people back as much as you would want to, which is why this idea of distinguishing between one depositor and the other is one that is unfortunately very necessary. Because I can't say make the same attempt to give back $1 million to somebody that has $1 million in the bank, and probably this person also has a good income because he has $1 million in net worth, to someone that has $50,000 in the bank. I have to give an advantage to the lower income person, because that person will starve if they get nothing back, if I prioritize somebody that has much more wealth.
You started off telling us that trust is so key in the sense of it's a large driver. The lack of trust, it makes a crisis much worse. And trust is fundamental to stabilizing a crisis and putting a country on the path to some form of recovery. I have to ask, just like I asked you, can the Lira be saved? Can these banks be saved?
There's different views on this. Some people have taken the position that, well, if after this whole process you end up with, I don't know, 10 banks instead of the 50 plus we have today that are able to be rescued, that people will gravitate towards those banks because they will have demonstrated that they could be rescued, because they're the last one standing. I think that is hard for me to conceive of, because given what, again, same as what people experienced with the Lira, given what people experienced in the banks, which is that we've gone 4 years with people not being able to withdraw their money, having to wait in humiliating lines to withdraw crumbs from their accounts, being treated very poorly. Are those people going to, at any point, start putting their net worth in Lebanese banks again? Aren't they going to remember this experience and say, you know what, I really don't want to, except for people that are forced to because they don't have another choice? I think what you're going to need very clearly is a very radical change in branding and management and ownership. You're going to need new banks, international banks, to encourage them to start competing in this market. I can't tell the future, and I don't know how short people's memory is, but it seems to me that after 4 years of not being able to access your deposit and being humiliated every day in the bank, it is just very hard for me to see how anyone will go back to trusting a Lebanese brand, one of these brands' banks again. Again, unfortunately, a wholly unnecessary issue. In 2019, when a lot of us were out there really putting a ton of pressure and doing a lot of public advocacy to pass a capital control law, to start with the restructuring process, people could see that these kinds of issues and crises that you go through, the reason you have to take action quickly is because if you don't, the crisis evolves into one that has much less pleasant solutions. And unfortunately, that's, every year you wait, the solutions become worse and worse and worse. 4 years ago, that threshold we were talking about may have been above 500,000. And at that point, you may have been able to rescue most of the Lebanese banks, and people would have trust in them again. The Lebanese pound would have devalued, sure, but not to the extent where people lost 99% of their value of their incomes. And so you could do a lot more. So unfortunately, that's why this is where we are today. You wait, your solutions become less available and less positive. There's not really anything you could do about that. It's an economic reality that you can't deviate from.
Can Lebanon survive without banks, not banks as they are now, with banks that have followed through the reforms and restructuring you're talking about? Can you have a functioning sort of economic system without banks? Functioning banks, of course.
No, there's no way, and to have a modern economy without banks that can lend to encourage businesses to grow, lend to the government even. This is what modern economies look like. You need a banking system. There's no country in the world without a functioning banking system that has been able to generate the amount of wealth that countries that do have banking systems are able to generate. And this is to say nothing of the rise of when you don't have a banking system, people don't trust banks, then they start using cash. When you're using cash, you have tax evasion. So governments can't fund themselves using tax revenue because nobody pays taxes. You have money laundering, you have drug trade, you have all these illicit activities, which you would have less of if you had a smaller cash economy and more reliance on banks. If Lebanon wanted to regrow its economy, without banks, it's never going to happen.
And who's the biggest benefactor of this cash economy?
There's kind of a rise of a new profiteering class in this country that's benefiting from the cash economy, from the multiple exchange rates, which we haven't even talked about. Really, anybody that doesn't depend on the banking system, that operates in the shadows in terms of the economy. A major beneficiary is Hezbollah, because they don't rely on the banking system here. They've always funded themselves through a cash economy. So relatively, they're better off. But aside from Hezbollah, you have the currency exchangers who benefit from the multiple exchange rates. Right now, you have a system where you have a different exchange rate depending on what area of the economy you're in. So if you have a bank account in dollars here, you can't withdraw it in dollars. You can withdraw it in Lebanese pounds at a designated 15,000 exchange rate. The market rate is 80,000 today. So you're not actually withdrawing a dollar, you're withdrawing a fraction of a dollar, but that's the exchange rate there. The central bank has this system, this platform where they sell dollars, God knows to who, to preferred clients at a yet another designated exchange rate, which is, I think today 45,000, maybe it's 70,000 between yesterday and today. And then you have the market rate. So you have all these different exchange rates. So people can end up arbitraging between these where, okay, I can buy at the 15,000 if I am able to get that preferential treatment, and then I could sell it at the market rate. And there's a huge profiteering community that's grown out of that, which is why you don't want multiple exchange rates, because it gives rise to this kind of corruption and deadweight loss in the economy.
You're pushing us to the final segment of this important discussion, which is, you started off telling us Lebanon, you put it so well, the crisis is complicated and in many ways it's simple. I tend to find one of the most confusing things is these multiple exchange rates, just understanding them, understanding what's taking place, how they're set, why they are there. Could you just, at least for my sake and maybe some of our audience, tell us a bit more about what's going on there?
Sure. Multiple exchange rates serve different purposes depending on where they're being used. So let's look at a big one. A big one is in the banking system. So, like I said, there's 90 plus billion of deposits in dollars in the Lebanese banking system, and there's not enough dollars to pay those. So rather than doing a restructuring, which is to say, all right, how much can we pay? What we can't pay, we need to do something with and get it out of the banking system, because we know we can't pay them back and they're just creating this huge weight on the banking system and not allowing it to operate. Rather than doing that, which is the appropriate process, in order to not admit that you have these massive losses, which still, the central bank doesn't even admit that these losses exist. What they're saying is that we will let people withdraw their money, but at a designated rate that we determine, which is 15,000. And an invented rate. Really, I don't know where it comes from. Nobody knows where it comes from. It's just invented. So when you go, you withdraw your money, you get it rather than getting, so let's say the rate is 15,000, the black market rate is 80. So what you're getting is 15 to 18 cents per dollar. So every dollar you withdraw, you're getting, let's say 18 cents. Instead of telling you that, they're just giving you 15,000 Lebanese pounds. So, okay, you got your deposit back. Now, the problem there is that who's paying that 15,000? Because even that 15,000 doesn't exist. How it's being paid for is by the central bank printing money that doesn't exist and giving it to the depositor via the bank. That's one of the main reasons why the currency is devaluing, but we're liquidating them by printing local currency, which treating it like it's something that has no value. Let's just print and give out to everybody so that we could pretend like everything is fine and we're paying people their deposit back. But what we're ultimately doing is debasing the currency. That is one area where the multiple exchange rate system is being used. Another place it's being used is in the Saidafa platform, which is this platform that the central bank invented also in order to sell dollars at a below market rate to whoever it decides it wants to sell to. One of the main beneficiaries there is public sector employees. So again, public sector employees are paid in Lebanese pounds. The value of their wage has gone down significantly. And without doing the proper public sector reforms and reforms of the budget and the public debt, you are not able really to give them a salary adjustment or to fix the value of their wage. So, what the central bank is doing in order to enable the political class to not do any reforms, they're saying, well, if you're a public sector employee, bring your Lebanese pound wage to me and I will exchange it for dollars at a preferred rate, meaning I'm giving you a 30, 40, 50% raise by selling you dollars at a rate that is below the market rate. So, if your wage is 4 million Lebanese pounds, and let's say I'm willing to sell you dollars at 40,000 pounds to the dollar, then I'll give you $100 for your 4 million, when that 4 million is really only worth $50 in the market. A salary increase that, again, costs the central bank money. And the way that it funds that is, again, by printing Lebanese pounds, buying those dollars in the market for 80,000 pounds, and then selling it to the public sector employee for 40,000. The difference there is a loss to the central bank, which is funded by printing more currency and debasing the value of the currency. Again, one of the other mechanisms that's resulting in the currency to devalue. There's many more mechanisms. Before we had the subsidy scheme, which is selling dollars to some merchants so they can import some staple goods, which then, rather than being sold in Lebanon to people that were supposed to be the beneficiaries of those subsidies, I saw them a dollar for, at the time, it was 1,500 pounds, way less than the market rate, but subsidized so that we can import rice and people could buy it at that 1,500 subsidized rate. You ended up finding those goods in supermarkets in Europe and Africa being sold for a way above subsidy rate, or being smuggled to Syria. Again, one of the other mechanisms that resulted in more losses to the central bank, more currency devaluation, but profits to a subset of the people in this country.
I want to build on that, and then I just want to ask you a few more questions before, I know we've taken so much of your time. In many ways, the centrality of the central bank is key. In the event that we should see a new central bank governor, what is the profile of such a central bank governor that is needed to mitigate it against all of these disastrous sort of policies that you've walked us through?
So the current central bank governor's term ends this summer. The search for a replacement, as far as I know, hasn't really even started yet, although there's names that kind of pop up from time to time. Today, it's hard for me to see anybody of good character agreeing to take on this role without knowing exactly what the political establishment and kind of the political arms of government plan to do. Because a central bank can't manage this crisis on its own. There's legislation that's needed. The financial sector restructuring needs legislation. All of the prerequisites of ultimately having an IMF program, they all need legislation. So if a central bank governor just comes and you plop him there there's really nothing that person is going to be able to do. What they might do is stop buying time. This is also another one of the debates here. To what extent should the central bank be buying time because there's no reforms being done? People have related it to the analogy of somebody enabling a drug user. Do I keep giving them money, which will not lead to them, solving the problem that they have, but will, lead to that person accruing more and more expenses and debt? And that's basically what's happening here. But to not be too polite, they've also enriched themselves personally by doing that. And they're not doing it with their money; they're doing it with the public's money. So this person needs to come into office knowing that having a plan for what is needed for Lebanon to get out of this crisis and pre-agreement from the political side to do those, because otherwise they're just going to come in and be blamed for everything.
If you and I have this conversation in 2019, I feel a lot of the same, certainly with some variants, but it'd be those key points that you've raised: the need for restructuring, the need for key reforms, the need for decisive leadership. And it hasn't happened for 4 years. Do you see it happening this year?
To be frank, I don't. I would have to be delusional to think that in 4 years, nothing happened, but now all of a sudden something is going to happen without there being any indication that we're actually on that path. So I'm not going to be hopeful that there's going to be that these work streams are going to be advanced until I start seeing evidence of them being advanced. And in fact, I think today we're further away from having an IMF program compared to where we were in 2020, because I felt an urgency at that time that is not there today. I think we're closer to something more akin to a plan B, where even politicians here, regardless of what we hear it from politicians here, we hear it from the international community, we hear it from everybody. It's almost become like a boilerplate talking points. Lebanon needs to implement reforms. Lebanon needs to implement reforms related to the IMF program. It's almost getting it's nauseating to hear them now, because it's like, are we not living on the same planet? People are just going to keep repeating the same line over and over again. An IMF program is so highly unlikely in Lebanon today, regardless of what people say. And I think, in fact, the international community is doing a disservice by just repeating those empty talking points while they meet with people who are actively undermining the IMF program and all the other related reforms.
No, it's a powerful statement, Mike. And I'll tell you why I ask, because what worries me is that for 4 years, there's been a de facto normalization of a situation that is anything but normal. The worry is that plan B that you're talking about. And maybe for our audience, could you tell us what the future for Lebanon looks like in the next 5 years? If the interventions you precisely mentioned in this chat, and I know you've talked about elsewhere, what if that doesn't materialize? What is the future for Lebanon in the next 4 years? What does it look like for you?
So, to me, what the plan B looks like here, which is the path of least resistance plan. Basically, we do nothing, or we do very little, and we just chug along from year to year until eventually you don't need to do a restructuring anymore, because you have liquidated all of those debts in the local currency by just printing and paying people back in an increasingly worthless currency. Eventually, the books will balance. Eventually, the exchange rate is going to go up so much and wages will be depressed so much that, yes, you are not going to be importing more than you're exporting, because people just can't afford to import anymore. These are the natural adjustments that will eventually happen. How long it's going to take is unknown, but that's what happens when you don't really do when you don't do anything. You just kind of let things go with gravity. The impact on people is severe. You know, you're going to have much more emigration, and actually, we have had very significant amounts of emigration over the last 4 years. I mean, I look at myself. I had tons of friends here in 2019, 2020, and now I have very few. Everyone's gone. UAE, US, Europe, everyone is just gone. And people who are not gone, their main objective in life today is, how do I get out of here? And I can't blame them for that. Some people don't have the luxury of getting jobs abroad and getting visas. They have to get on boats and pray that they'll make it to Cyprus or to Greece or to Italy or wherever. A lot of those don't make it. When you have that level of emigration, then who exactly is going to contribute to rebuilding your economy and restarting growth? Once you're middle class and upper middle class, and they're actually the first to leave, once those, that capital is gone, that human capital, you just don't have the building blocks anymore to grow your economy and to reach the level that you were at or where you could have been had they stayed. And there's no guarantee they'll come back. To say nothing of the significant poverty you're going to have, the lives that you're going to have ruined here, and the breakdown of basic public services. I have cousins that have been trying to get a driver's license for a year now, and they're just not able to because public services have totally broken down. Nobody comes to the office anymore. And now, there's a whole other aspect, which is, we're already a politically very unstable country. So in terms of security, where do you go? There other people could speak, more intelligently, but what I'm seeing here is a lot more reliance on the neighborhood, the city. People just don't, they don't care what's happening in Beirut anymore because they realize we can't trust, there's no government. We can't trust the government with our futures. So far today, it's still under control, but ultimately people are just not going to, they're not going to be able to continue living in this way. And then you have, potential security risks.
Look, Lebanon's crisis, hasn't combusted overnight, and it hasn't done so behind closed doors. You left us with a powerful statement that the international community is, in many ways, um,
Enabling.
enabling.
I don't know if that's the word you're looking for, but that's the word I would use.
Is there an alternative approach that you could recommend they take?
It is a tough question, so I won't pretend that there's an easy answer to it. But I think the policy of enabling is one that clearly doesn't work, because had they not enabled, starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, we would not have even reached this level of economic and wealth destruction that we have. So clearly, enabling doesn't work. I ask somebody who's living abroad, if your government had done nothing to stem one of the worst economic crises in modern history, where you saw your life savings disappear, you saw your income get cut by 90%, there was shelves were empty in the supermarket, and your government did nothing, and your political establishment did nothing. What would you want to see? I'll tell you what I'd want to see. I'd want to see real consequences. I used to be opposed to sanctions. I'm not anymore because, I don't care. There's a group of people holding this country hostage, and there needs to be some consequences to what they're doing. There's people who've laundered their money in Europe and in the US, Lebanese politicians and senior officials. They need to be gone after with much more effort. You criticize, and I'm talking about, Western and North American officials, where you criticize this like phantom. Who are you criticizing? Who is it that is obstructing an IMF program and obstructing reforms? You can't be meeting with that person and then putting out a statement, oh, we had a fruitful meeting, we all acknowledge there needs to be XYZ reforms, when it's that those people you're meeting with are the ones that are not doing the reforms. So I think there needs to be a stronger stick and a weaker carrot. Now the role of every minister in a Lebanese government is to just go do the begging tour. Let me go to France, to the UK, to Germany, to UAE, to the US, and just beg them for money so that they could pay the salaries of our public employees, so that they could pay for our wheat imports. I mean, the World Bank is still lending us money to pay for wheat imports, because we refuse to do any reforms. There will, at some point, they're considering paying for lending us money that we can't pay back, by the way, so that we can import gas and electricity from Jordan and Egypt. So it's not my job to come up with a kind of approach for the international community. But what I can say is that this approach does not work. It is enabling and strengthening the people who are preventing this country from getting out of this crisis.
No, well noted, Mike. Powerful as always. And thank you for really highlighting many of the drivers and implications of Lebanon's nearly 4 year crisis. I want to end our conversation with a question, if you don't mind me asking, that I deal with on a daily basis. You and I are both in Beirut. And I want to ask you, why are you still here?
It's a tough question because I've gone through multiple points in my life here where I've considered leaving. Probably after the blast, the August 4 explosion was the closest I got to leaving. Because at that point, I was thinking, this country is just not fit for human habitation. You know, there was a massive, unnecessary explosion in the port in the middle of the capital because of total incompetence. And I live maybe 600-700 meters from the port, and I was injured in the blast. And what I saw in my neighborhood in the aftermath was something that no person should see in their life ever. And it built in me this type of like a rage against the people who I hold responsible for getting this country that doesn't deserve to be in this situation, and a people that don't deserve to be suffering in this way. But ultimately, I realized, I could leave anytime I want. I could pick up my bags and leave, but my family can't. My extended family here. I have a lot of friends here who can't. So I don't want to leave and think I've abandoned this place without being 100% sure that I did everything in my power to at least have a record of the destruction that was caused and not let history be rewritten, 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And so, because I know I can't change the situation here, but what I can do is let there be an ongoing record of where the obstruction was, what was happening, so that down the line, people know what happened. And when anybody comes and asks me today, like this podcast, what's happening in Lebanon, I could say, honestly, what is happening. And I could be a voice, which I think is a voice that is, I'm doing all I can to just honestly diagnose everything that's happening here so that nobody gets misled, not foreign officials, not the IMF, not the World Bank, not, the MEI's audience. And then I will know that I did what I can, and I could live the rest of my life peacefully knowing I did what I could for my country.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for your voice, for your honesty, and for your courage. And really, I think to the theme of our conversation about where we place trust, I think for me it is always to place trust in the power of ordinary people doing the right thing, people like you. So thank you very much for the work you're doing. And thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick, for having me. Thanks, everybody.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.